We also made important steps forward in strengthening our major defense partnerships. And our countries discussed ways to deepen our science and our technology partnerships to harness technology for the global good. So many major investments in Indian technology by U.S. private sector companies, as well as government-to-government conversations. I would say if I had to summarize it distinctly, most of the discussions really centered on peace. How do you build, sustain, establish peace in the world? And how can we have durable peace that the United States and India work on across the world in the face of new and existing threats. And by those threats, I don't just mean war. A peace that's threatened by health challenges, by climate challenges, by poverty, by perceived or real divisions between geography, north, south, east, west. And as the joint statement showed, as a lot of veterans, I welcomed, I think, the fourth former ambassador to India from the U.S. this weekend for an informal conversation in my house. And all four of them in the last 2 weeks as I've met them have said, we can't believe how much substance is are in the joint statements that are put forward. It's clear you're doing deep, serious, important work that isn't just about saying we will talk more, but we will do more. And I think the joint statement reflected that. Both countries resolved to promote a resilient, rules-based international order, to safeguard a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific through the Quad and other mechanisms. On global issues, the ministers discussed the tragic humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East, reiterating their stance with Israel against terrorism, but also seeking to alleviate civilian suffering and adherence to international humanitarian law. We also made important steps forward in strengthening our major defense partnership, which continues to grow, increasing acceleration that we've seen through initiatives like the Roadmap for U.S.-India Industrial Cooperation, U.S.-India Defense Acceleration Ecosystem, so INDEX and IDEX, and expanded collaboration and cooperation in emerging domains, and also, more importantly, because we sometimes just focus on weapons and what's being sold or potentially co-developed, but the operational level of our militaries, which I think is as critical as any equipment. And our countries discussed ways to deepen our science and our technology partnerships to harness technology for the global good instead of technology that harms us and divides us, technology that can connect us and protect us. And these efforts are moving forward at a record-breaking speed under the U.S.-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, or iCET. Over the past year, we've seen so many advances. We're looking forward to welcoming more visitors in December, January around iCET themes, but so many major investments in Indian technology by U.S. private sector companies, as well as government-to-government conversations, expanding around space, defense co-production, and planetary defense as well. So in short, it was a very successful meeting. I'll give an editorial. I've witnessed many of these gatherings now in my lifetime, and just the warmth between the principles and the depth of the substance is pretty unique for these. Oftentimes people will fly around the world, have 3 to 5 things to talk about, they're important, good to maintain relations. This is at a deeper level. It's at a level in which people know each other over many years now and turn to each other, whether it's U.S.-India relations or whether it's talking about other parts of the world. Increasingly, the United States and India really see each other as collaborators in figuring out the global architecture and the global solutions to some of the toughest things that we face. And that work to promote peace, to promote more prosperity, to protect our planet and our people, those 4 Ps that I talk about really shone through during the 2+2. So with that, happy to answer questions from you and from anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. 2+2, and also I think the broader direction of India-US relationship, of which 2+2 perhaps is an indication of the fact that institutionalization has taken place of this relationship, and India being and US being between 2 partners, and that's I think you alluded to in your remarks. A bit more, perhaps, if you can elaborate on we are at the moment in a place where multiple conflicts are raging in multiple geographies. And there might be some concerns, perhaps in this part of the world, that with America so consumed by Eurasia, Middle East, is there enough bandwidth for Indo-Pacific? Because Indo-Pacific from the beginning had been a very important part of this conversation. Where do you see the 2 nations, what are the elements, what are the engagements at the moment on the Indo-Pacific? and was this iteration of 2+2 able to give enough substance to that aspect of the relationship, given everything else that's going on in the world?
I would say at least half of the conversation actually was just about Indo-Pacific, the bilateral relationship and the regional relationship. So absolutely, I would say the proof is in the pudding. We continue to not only see the secretaries show up here in the midst of one of the most critical security moments in our lifetimes, but that priority won't change, and I don't believe it'll change in our lifetime. I don't say that lightly. The nomination of Kurt Campbell to be Deputy Secretary of State, and there's two Deputy Secretaries of State. One was my predecessor, Richard Verma. Speaks to two folks who know India well and know the Indo-Pacific extremely well, being the two deputies under Secretary Blinken, whose commitment to the Indo-Pacific region is clear. The Secretary of Defense continues to look not just at the counterparts that are here, but how we can look at our technological defense futures together. That's a very big step, and something that I think India-U.S. observers wouldn't believe if you transported them here from 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. There's one other thing that's emerged between us that I find interesting. I call it geometric diplomacy. I joke that India, the government of India, really loves geometric shapes, triangles and quadrilaterals, whether it's the two quads that we have, whether it's the trilateral development partnership that we have with countries like Fiji, and we're looking at other Pacific Island countries, maybe Africa, where we come together, two countries not just talking about themselves, but I think both of our countries do believe that we should play a role in the world. It's easy to make a caricature of that. In the past, maybe India was an online movement, America was part of the bipolar world. It's different. I think both of us come from a place of humility on this, that we can't do everything, and certainly people turn to us as a power saying, can't you solve the world's problems? We want to try, but we know that we can't single-handedly do that, which is why we need a partner like India. And vice versa, I think India knows that when they have a partner like America at a place like G20, look at what we can produce together. Not just in a joint statement that has no opposition or footnotes, but the substance of the statement, which gets into the most pressing issues of women's empowerment, of financial and digital infrastructure, of reform of important international institutions. I do believe we have the bandwidth. I think we're showing that bandwidth, and that doesn't come from just a diplomatic calculation. I think it comes from a core value of understanding what's important in the world for us, and that's the Indo-Pacific.
And Ambassador, this conversation, I wanted to understand from you, if you go back to, say, February 2022 when the conflict started, to now almost close to 2 years to the conflict. This understanding about Russia between India and the US, what has been the trajectory like, and what is the assessment now in Washington about this relationship, and perhaps what should be expected or not to be expected vis-a-vis the US's concerns and the US's aims with regard to both Russia and India when it comes to the US engagement?
I think the U.S. understands with our friends that people have different histories and strategic considerations. We also believe that speaking bluntly and forcefully about principles of international law are important. As I remind our Indian friends, you all know and live even more existentially than the United States, needing the importance of boundaries and of sovereignty to be guiding principles, which is what we're standing up for when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. It's clear, unprovoked, aggressive war action taken by one country against another should not be a part of the international order. But we haven't let that be an impediment, and more than that, we've seen also the evolution of being able to work together to try to continue an agenda that can't be stopped by the conflict of the war. G20, I think, was a good example of that, where India played a clear role in making sure there wasn't Russian opposition, and the United States played a clear role in bringing together our friends and allies to make sure we elevated up conversations even as we spoke our principles, I would argue, even more forcefully in the G20 communique that came out this time than in Bali.
And finally, before I open, lots of false starts in the past. How optimistic are you that this time we are on a different countries would be able to deliver on what each side needs?
I think this is no longer feeling, it's action. It's no longer ambition, it's actually real concrete work. And as I said before, it's happening probably really on three levels. It's the development of technologies, it's the sales of weapons and ways of being able to operate, but it's also the operational structures themselves. What came out of the 2+2, for instance, was joining the Combined Maritime Task Force. India is going to be a part of that now, looking at developing more intelligence sharing, more operational ability to make calls at the commander level should there be conflict, to look at the sea domain awareness, which is really important for India. The Indian Ocean is a place where too many people are flying blind right now, and we need to look at common threats together there. So, the technology ensures in some ways that we will be on this road together. This isn't just a flash in the pan for a year. This isn't just about a weapons sale, but something like the GE engines means we'll be co-developing for decades to come. So it's a long-term commitment to one another. This isn't a short-term thing. And to me, that's the biggest story sometimes lost, is while this is deepened, and you can talk about the individual projects, sales, engagements, co-development, I think both sides now, I was talking to an Indian defense official who said, before we were, not the closest of friends, then we became friendly but not trusting. Now we're friendly and trusting. And I would offer one more thing, we're friendly, trusting, and committed.
Thank you. Let me open this up for your questions, comments of the media.
Understand about the status of the IPEF trade talks. We have been seeing reports of the last 2 weeks how the US has plans to take it up at some stage. And when was this communicated to India?
So we've been in regular communication with IPEF and actually took some nice steps forward. Minister Goyal was, as you know, at APEC in San Francisco, and India has indicated and now signed on to pillars that previously had not been a part of, which was very exciting news to us and showed strong intention, even as we, I think in the medium term, see if we can align labor, environmental standards, some technology issues as well, and agriculture, those 4 areas that in the past have kind of kept India away from the table, but now India has clearly indicated we want to be at the table, sign everything that we can, and see where we move forward in the areas that we might still have some distance between us. For trade, that's not a permanent pause of any sort. I think that's a momentary one. And we've been in regular communication. That's the one that maybe some of our Indian counterparts breathe a sigh of relief, because that's one of the places where there's traditionally been some distance. But I would say this in the most abstract and bilateral terms, that I do think it's time for us to raise our ambition between the United States and India when it comes to trade. And that works both directions. We've talked a lot in the defense relationship about preferred geography. I think that is a concept that we should explore more deeply when it comes to trade as well. Because, quite frankly, our trade, if we're going to take it up to the 300 billion level or the $500 billion level that some have talked about, we're going to have to do a lot of work in the coming years. We're going to have to change the way we treat one another, whether that's opportunities for Indian companies with the Inflation Reduction Act, which addresses climate change, but also investments in the future of electric vehicles and energy, or whether it's here with tariff barriers that make it very difficult for foreign direct investment to come in, even when it's fleeing places like China to India, where they're seen as too many barriers, and if you can't bring things in, you can't make things to export out. And so there's a lot of talk around that trade, but it's not that is not some sort of permanent pause. I think it's a temporary one around some issues that have to be worked out with some of the IPEF partners.
Read on the G20 and attack what happened really to make it such.
Oh, and I don't know does anybody know what a 20-sided shape is? I was referring more to the triangular and quadrilateral relations when it came to that. But the G20, I think that, look, 3 things happened. India did a superb job, I think, of giving the voice to those who have not been a part of the G20. And by the way, the U.S. and India together, it was the U.S. who first called, I think we were the first voice with India to include the African Union as members of the G20, really showed that we weren't going to fall into camps. There's not just India with the so-called Global South and U.S. leading the West and Europe and other places. We actually are 2 distinct nations who care about engaging, especially in places globally where there's poverty, in elevating those voices and bringing them to the table. So that was, I think, the first thing, really bringing those voices in the pre-conversation, as India did so well with the developing world, and America's support for AU and others joining. Second, I think that India did a good job of going to some of its traditional friends and allies, certainly having a blunt conversation with countries like Russia, like let's see what we can do together and not. It's so easy. Any one country can make a statement not unanimous. So it requires the right partners going to the right people to deliver the right messages at the right time. And the fact that India was a chair, I think India put its own relationships on the line for the success of the greater good. And vice versa, so did the United States. We went to friends, we worked out ways to reshape, still stand up for our principles. As I said, when I look at the statement around Ukraine, it's actually stronger language and more detailed language than Bali. Period. So bringing folks together, then there were no footnotes. And I think you can talk to our Sherpa, Jeff Pyatt, who did a really great job, and you can talk as well to Amitabh Kant, who I think did an amazing job in his team. And those two together just showed what, if the U.S. and India want to do things together, the world can follow.
If I'm allowed, just one very short question and a longer one. Given what we've seen since the October 7th attacks in Israel, followed by Israel's bombardment of Gaza for the past month and more, the deaths of civilians that have set off a wave, if you like, of repercussions for the future in terms of Middle East and West Asian relationships between the Arab world and Israel. What kind of impact do you think these developments are going to have on you? And the short question is, given that both the Republic Day in India and the next Quad hinge on the US President's acceptance of coming to 2024.
On your second question, I have nothing to add right now. When White House is ready and makes that decision, that will be forthcoming, but I have nothing to add to that right now. I do think to the first question, the fundamental logic of these agreements and these ideas like IMEC will stand the test of time. But there's no question that conflict will give it some pause. The region is not capable, in fact, I would argue the world is not capable of dreaming of rebuilding, of new building, when there's ongoing war, and that's just a reality of conflict. But I know how hard our leaders, President Biden, as you saw, Secretaries Blinken and Austin are working to try to create peace and to make it a just peace as well, to have humanitarian pauses that make sure that people get relief and can be taken away from conflict, and that hostages that have been taken can be reunited with their families. It's an immensely traumatic moment for Palestinians and Israelis right now. And I think it is our hope as a government that coming out of this, we have to ensure that this isn't just the cessation of conflict. It has to be the building of peace, of two states, of a Palestinian state that can stand on its own feet without terrorism, and an Israel that can be secure and can protect its people and exist. And I know that's what they're working very, very hard on. High Commissioner, I said, if you lose, they're probably going to be nicer to you tomorrow.
Any plans, Ambassador, to take it to the level of trilateral 2+2 dialogue or quadrilateral dialogue or multilateral dialogue?
Well, we have an idea to add Japan and make this thing called the Quad, so yes. We're hopeful, obviously, India's leadership for the Quad this coming year. We're doing everything we can to ensure, with 2 elections in both countries. I think the Diet is in session in January as well, and Australia's National Day is the same as your Republic Day, so it's a complex scheduling thing, not just one of intention. But the intention has been clear. Our president, his first international engagement face-to-face when he became president was the Quad in Washington, D.C. If that doesn't say where his priorities and our priorities as a country are, nothing does. And absolutely, when it comes to Australia and India and the United States, there's a lot of work that we can be doing in the Indian Ocean together, militarily, for domain awareness, I think technologically when it comes to defense, but also things like critical minerals, where you have deposits in in India and in Australia that the United States, with our historic investments in kind of climate economy, could play a big role. When we look at the preservation of the Indian Ocean itself, the fisheries, the biodiversity of it, we have ongoing conversations between our 3 countries, and oftentimes Japan will be a part of that in the Quad mechanism, but I was just speaking with the High Commissioner about us engaging more on that. I'm in regular contact with my colleague, my counterpart, Caroline Kennedy, who's the ambassador in Australia. we placed a bet on the cricket. But I did it well, so in case I lost, I would win. The winner has to buy the losing ambassador drink, so she owes me drinks for the victory last night. But we're engaged all the time in terms of some of the work that we can do between both countries, and we're very excited to see the 2+2 come back for Australia, not just for us, because I know it was a tough scheduling thing to do with elections here, but I want to thank Minister Singh and Minister Jaishankar for making it a priority with both of our countries.
Is President Biden likely to attend that virtually, and or will there be more debates? Any thoughts on that?
Oh no, look, whether it's included, the conversation is really up to India as the chair. India sets the agenda in this last of India's chairing the G20. I don't have anything to announce or to add yet. It's right around our Thanksgiving holiday, so I know the scheduling is very tough. But I don't think they've announced one way or another whether the president is able to. Was that announced since I was gone yesterday? But look, the commitment of this president to be here physically in G20, to elevate the Quad, to receive the Prime Minister, nobody should mistake anything, but as I've shared with all of you, the president's highest regard, he thinks this is the most consequential relationship in the world, and I know he will try anything to try to be there, but I don't know his schedule.
Let me go back.
Ambassador, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You talked about how India and the United States can collaborate in the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
So regarding critical metals especially.
Well, I often talk about our relationship as being from the seabed to the stars, and it's true. I think it is really from the bottom of the ocean all the way into the heavens now. I've never thought of that, and I haven't heard conversation, but I think we would welcome that. There's no question. If we are going to be technological partners, siblings, in the development of using technology for good, this is a great example. Space is the other one, the other direction, where we're looking not only at government-to-government space collaboration. We had the head of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory here recently. We're welcoming the NASA director in just a week. In a week, he will be in town. We'll be welcoming him here. We have things to learn from ISRO. ISRO has learned many things from NASA, but it's also now in the commercial space too. And I think it's that same model that could work undersea. It's not just a strategic concern for our militaries. I think it's a humanitarian, ecological concern as well. So we welcome that, but I haven't heard anything across my desk, but you've given me a good idea. Thank you.
So I think we are having trouble in the mic.
I had a question about the 2+2 joint statement,
Yes.
which you said was very comprehensive.
Yeah.
I was reading the earlier joint statements also from 2018
Mm-hmm.
to yesterday last time. The point that was very striking was the absence of Pakistan explicitly in the joint statement this time. Why was it missing in the paragraph about terrorism? And also the phrase cross-border terrorism has always been there in all the joint.
To that, I don't know the history in 2018. Usually that's something that's asked from the Indian side, but I don't know the answer to that, but it was certainly nothing from the American side.
India and the US relationship, we've had some reports about disagreements over the elections that are coming up in Bangladesh. Certainly questions about democracy, human rights. Secretary Blinken has been very clear about the fact that America wants to see free and democratic elections in Bangladesh. There have apparently been some closed-door disagreements between India and the United States, given the criticality of Bangladesh to India. Could you comment on that?
You know, it's funny when you become U.S. ambassador to India. It's not my jurisdiction to speak about U.S. policy in Bangladesh, so I want to be very careful about that. I will restate statements, which is that obviously we want to see free and fair elections. There's never an intended outcome of those, and I think the proof is when there's been sanctions put on, it's not one party or other. It's usually done in a very equal way to send a message that if we can use power to reduce violence during elections, we will. That's a principle we stand for.
What are your views on how this will pan out here?
+2, and so did Secretary Austin. While we go to these engagements are critically important. For instance, the U.S. and Chinese militaries, China had cut off all communication all the way up to our Secretary of Defense to at the operational level. And given the number of accidents that can happen, disentanglements, something very dangerous could occur if we didn't have that communication reopened up. Second, in areas like climate action or dealing with the precursors to drugs that have killed 1 million people in the United States over the last years. These are important conversations to have, but we have them with eyes wide open. As we've said, sometimes this will be somebody we compete with. Hopefully sometimes it's somebody we'll collaborate with, but we all benefit from calmer waters. And when the waters get too choppy, engagement is the way to do that. But we do that eyes wide open without expectations of a changed system, of reduced hostilities. But we think if we stand together with countries like India, our partners in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, East China Sea, when we look at the conflict that you have here and what we can do to be supportive of peace, it's the same sort of engagement that is happening at the military level between India and China. You have to talk or else things get worse, and this was an example of that. But the good outcomes that came out of it so far that we've seen is a willingness for China to step up on the precursor chemicals that many drugs are manufactured from. It's actually something great for us as friends to be working on here too, which is a priority, because those drugs don't just come to the US, they'll come to India, they can come to China, etc. And to work at ways that we can communicate directly better between our militaries to disentangle conflict. And then third, some of the work around climate, the commitments that we're making to decarbonize both of our economies that we hope we can have further work with China, and historically we have. That was the main conversations. And it's a fun place to live, and I love what Indians love. I always think you need to see a country through the eyes of the people who are your neighbors here. And you can't get to know India without eating its food. You can't get to know India without going to cricket matches. And even more than that, the things that don't come to the news that aren't public diplomacy initiatives, it's the work I get to do to listen to a female laborer in Ahmedabad who talks about climate change through the description of how hot it is to hold bricks, or a girl with the name Maya that I meet in a family in Kerala when I was down there, same name as my daughter, and they invite me to dinner at the hotel, and we just hear each other's life stories. You know, I think you can't be a good diplomat if you're not a good listener, and you certainly are never going to build power if you don't share power. And sharing power comes from understanding where people come from, or what their hopes are, what their aspirations are, celebrating with them at the highest moments, or even like last night, hugging each other at some of the lower ones.
But Ambassador,
to do over here. I try not to follow my own social media because it's too painful, but thank you.
Sir, just one question. Regulations. So I just wanted to know, how are you navigating on that?
You mean proposed regulations from Indian government?
Yeah,
I think, we try not to wag a finger. We try to offer those companies that India wants to see greater investment from, giving feedback. For instance, when it came to, I think, two laudable goals: security for your computer equipment and a desire to see more of that manufactured in India, we sit down and say, listen to some companies how we might get there, and know the effect is not just for a Dell or an Apple wondering about how much will a consumer pay for a computer here in India, but also companies that want to invest and set up offices suddenly have to now make a calculation of how much more the computers they buy for the office will be, even though they're not a computer company. So, and we usually get very good response. I mean, we try to engage with humility, but also with pretty forthright feedback, and we try not to give it just as a government, but we say, look, we know that you want more semiconductor companies to invest, you want more technology companies here, you want to build an EV infrastructure. Don't take it from us, take it from the people who do this for a living, who want to be in India, and they will tell you how they can invest more, create more jobs in India, and come here, and how proposed regulations will affect them. So I think the data law was a great example of that. It got reworked in a way that I think American companies that provide a lot of good jobs here and good services here can live with and are pleased with. And I would hope that the development of future policies where we are standing ready, willing, and able to be pre-consulted as well as to consult post the proposals.
Which is currently the hottest thing in which is currently the hottest thing, and even our government is talking about global regulation around AI.
Yeah.
Has there been any conversation between the two governments on coming up with a formal framework, which then, as a corollary, leads to possible standards which increases the ability for trade between both the countries, and not just for between both the countries, but building solutions for the larger globe as such?
There's not been formal discussions launched, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do down the line, and there's been a lot of informal, more than informal, because informal sounds like it's casual. There's been in-depth conversations without that being the goal yet. Our Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, led that conversation with Prime Minister Modi and joined at the end by President Biden, with really the tech leaders in both countries at the White House during the state visit. It was one of the more impressive, I've been to a lot of these roundtable things, and sometimes it's just words. It was actually very substantive, and a lot of work has come out of that since. I do think, though, that I would flag America and India need to deepen their AI conversation. I joke I should found something, the AI, the America India Artificial Intelligence Action Initiative, AI cute, or something. So stand by, we'll see. But it's more than a cute name. I think that when you have two democracies who engage in this, as we've done, for instance, around telecommunications, we had worries about Chinese equipment for telecoms. But it was India that acted first, and actually, as Prime Minister Modi shared in our session together with the secretaries, really talked about what an influence and impact that had in Europe at the time, UK, who were going to look at Huawei equipment. India has led on DPI. India has led on things like reducing the cost of data to make it truly democratic to all people, and so. In AI, I would say, now that we're first movers, and I think the president felt very strongly, usually you want to consult, usually you want to build this over time, but if you don't get out in front of AI, the consequences, even if it's a small percentage likelihood of something catastrophic happening with artificial intelligence and biotech and warfare and other things, could be sooner than we believe. So we have to, I think, regulate a little earlier than Americans usually would, and ask for data sharing, ask for architecture to be transparent, for us to understand how the artificial intelligence models learn, and put some limits potentially on how that learning could be harmful, anonymous, open source, and used by malicious actors. So as two democracies who I think have a very different model than dictatorships or autocracies, this could be another example of what I talked about, a multiplicative relationship that has more power than just two great countries together. So stand by on that. But there's been deep conversations, not a formal proposal from either side yet.
Again, coming back to the geometric diplomacy that you're talking about and its application in sub-regional diplomacy in South Asia.
Yes.
And it's my belief that, ever since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's a rethinking on apart from Afghanistan, what is America's South Asia policy and diplomacy. So I'm coming back to making the case for an India-US deeper partnership and commitment towards providing alternative pathways for infrastructure building and infrastructure financing, which are more transparent, vis-a-vis the strategic footprints that the Chinese BRI has created in South Asia. Could offer something like insights.
Sure. I was very pleased to see the Prime Ministers of India and Bangladesh meet on the border, where the train gauge changes to be able to actually take goods from one side of the border to the other, because the gateway into Southeast Asia on that border means that something like iMEC wouldn't just be from Europe to India stopping, but could be from Europe all the way to Southeast Asia. And really creating something that isn't a model of debt-based financing where countries find themselves in debt, unable to renegotiate, as we've seen neighboring countries do, to have a model that is based on multilateral and fair deals on infrastructure that are not about the lowest bidder today, but about the best investment over the long term. We have a program actually where we help countries train how to do public bidding. And we have no agenda besides kind of our own experience as Americans. To sometimes the lowest bid is attractive, but if you don't look at the terms, for 20, 30 years you're going to be in a tough place strategically and economically. Sometimes you want to go with actually the most solid long-term financing and proposal. And I think we're very open to that. And we're open to doing that with India. We've had, in the 2+2, there's conversations about Africa, the Pacific Islands, even Minister Jaishankar recently being in our hemisphere, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and places where we might be able to work together. I saw a beautiful version of this with what we call TRIDEP, which is the Trilateral Development Initiative that we have, where Fijian doctors and medical professionals came here to India with American dollars and some know-how, but mostly Indian trainers, to be able to have telemedicine in the most remote parts of Fiji. It was the largest training Fiji had ever done in any country. And this was, again, this triangle that was put together And now we're looking at doing that in parts of Southeast Asia together. So I think that the sky is the limit there. I just recently came back from Bhutan, where I met with the king and the former king, and looked at some of their ambitions for technology that really is about twinning some of the future of Bhutan with the development of India's economy, and also the transport of goods that would come through northern India. So if we think creatively, and IMEC, look, was put together pretty quickly. Nobody thought that it would actually be in the G20 joint statement, and it was. And I think it wasn't a political agreement that came together quickly. Everybody who saw it said, that makes so much sense. And we have the capability and the capacity to do this. So I think you'll see more of that in the years ahead. And the question was asked before, with all the conflict in the world, can we still go forward with that? I think we can, because there's so many pieces of it. Even if one part of that has a pause, that doesn't mean we can't begin building a model elsewhere.
Yes. Joint statement. There's an entire paragraph that focuses on Israel-Hamas war. And it speaks of release of hostages. There's also humanitarian, nothing has changed on the ground. So I ask, is the humanitarian pause conditional to release of hostages? There are over 4,500 children who are dead. Any condemnation of death of civilians, and at what cost? How many deaths would be enough, as many are asking?
Sure. I can't speak to the conditions of the negotiations because I'm not involved in them. But I have read, and certainly I think it is the principle, as people's children are there as hostages and children are dying, that there has to be a connectivity between the two. That I think for Israelis, I don't want to speak for them, but as Israelis, to just pause without people coming home makes no sense, and vice versa. For there not to be a pause continues the suffering on both sides. You know, there are easy questions to ask, but you cannot quantify suffering. There's trauma on both sides that's deeper. You know, I had an Indian friend who did the calculation. Imagine 20,000 during the Mumbai attack, 20,000 hostages were suddenly taken and today are being held. And you know somebody who's that family member. You don't get rational or reasonable about the numbers. But what we do need is for those of us who are not Palestinian or Israeli to really use every tool that we have to ensure that their civilians whose suffering can be alleviated, and then a permanent peace, because we might find a pause and we might find a peace, but what ensures this doesn't happen again? And I think that's the most important question to answer.
Ambassador, we are running out of time and we have lots of questions. So
theory, to solution, is it still on the table, or is it something that's withered away or not at all relevant anymore?
Great. I'll come back to you after I get that question.
Second one for AI. To develop tech products for the US Armed Forces. So is there a talk about reciprocity in the terms of US startups developing tech products for the Indian Defense Forces, especially in the critical tech sector? And are there timelines envisaged for the Indus X products? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Update how much there has been less delay, because we have heard stories of 500 days and 600 days perhaps, but if you can talk about that.
Yeah.
So anyone else?
Okay. So on visas, as you know, this is a strong priority for me and for the president. I don't know enough American history to be able to definitively say this, but I'm pretty sure no president has ever asked an ambassador to speed up visa time before President Biden told me specifically, go speed up visa time when it came to India. And it's something that, as you all know, it's an almost unsolvable problem, because the moment wait times go down, more Indians apply, and wait times go up, and then wait times are high, so fewer Indians apply, and then wait times go down. But that aside, that kind of law of physics aside, I'm so proud of our consular staff that is working the same number of people, though thanks to MEA we're getting new people in to our brand new consulate in Hyderabad, which will help the national numbers, and those folks are being hired as we speak and coming on board. But with this, primarily the same number of people using technology, working smarter and working harder, the stats are pretty clear. We are doing a third more visas in 2/3 less time than the worst moment that we stopped at. Now you can, as reporters, you can always find like that day one appointment that hits the 576 in one location, and it's a tough metric, I know, to measure as reporters, because there's 5 different locations, there's different visa types, and so we're trying to look in the coming days, how can we provide more clear information? But you know, there are some places where wait times were very short, a matter of just months, a few months, and other places where if you go to that place for that kind of visa, yes, there's a backlog that could be more than a year. But we have probably 10 to 15% more visas that we will process this year than last year. Already we've broken last year's record this year with almost a month and a half left. And we're committed to working with the government of India too to continue to bring more people here, especially with our commitment to look at opening the Bengaluru and Ahmedabad consulates. And I just went to see the spaces yesterday before the cricket match to see where we could grow those spaces in those places, even if it's preparatory work that help people fill out the paperwork ahead of time. We're never going to stop and pause, constantly making this better, constantly making this more simple, and listening to our Indian counterparts. Last piece I'll say is I've been very aggressive at looking at Washington. Let India be kind of the case study and a laboratory for visa innovation, because you're not alone. I know India might feel like it's alone. Mexico, Brazil, we have 2 or 3 big countries where the same problem happens, where the volume is just so overwhelming. And we have some ideas of how we might be able to address that, and I'm hoping in the coming year you will see that not just have more people working smarter with the system as it is, but maybe being able to change some fundamental parts of the system to make it easier for Indians. But the good news is more Indian students than ever, more Indian tourists than ever, wait times down 2/3 from the worst moment and 1/3 more on average of all of the visas. You asked that. So yes, it is a two-way street, absolutely. And we actually have the proof in both Indicex and IDEX. So recently, I was at the conference with the Navy here in Delhi, where there was 2 IDEX, Indicex collaborations announced. One for oil spills here in the India area, and one I think that was about undersea awareness for biodiversity, of like 2 challenges that we face, where we're looking at our small to medium-sized companies developing technology together to help a problem that the Indian Navy has put out. So you're going to see this go both directions. And by the way, most problems aren't really Indian or American. If you have the problem, we probably do, and vice versa. So, whether it was us looking at armored vehicles together and co-producing that here, that's at a bigger company level, the next generation of Indian armored vehicles, and one day India having the ability to manufacture and export those, or whether it's some of the problem solving. Some of this is not just defense, but like in space, I would see Indian companies who are going to be in the American space market quite aggressively, and vice versa. We would expect that comes with open up both directions. This isn't about protecting India and letting folks go out and do things in America. You will benefit, trust me, from more coming in, because then more goes out as well. As to the 2-state solution, absolutely. I pray yes. And it has never not been our policy. We have not, that is the official policy of the United States and continues to be. And I think it is the only way that, out of war can come deeper tragedy and suffering for a long period of time, or breakthroughs. I mean, that's what history teaches us, right? The moment of the most suffering is that is the moment when people are so traumatized or so exhausted they go in the correct direction. Sometimes they don't, and it goes on for many, many years, but haven't we had that for a long time in the Middle East? So it's certainly something I personally believe, it's something that our government believes, it's something the President believes, and that Secretary Blinken has said very publicly and is working towards. But you can't negotiate a 2-state solution in the midst of the conflict there today, but that has to be the outcome if you don't want to see this repeat tomorrow.
So now the final round of questions, please.
Canada,
yeah.
with the minister, with Minister Jaishankar, I wanted to ask: has there been any assurance from India that they will join the investigation?
So, Sardar Dyal Singh Majithia from Indian Army.
Yes.
As we see, space and defense are 2 highly cooperated sectors between both the partners. Perhaps we don't see space for defense.
Right.
With the private sector space being opening up in India shortly. The major crunch that has been felt right now, despite there are a whole lot of players in the market, the technology or the sharing of technology, the transfer of technology is the major concern when space comes for defense.
Yes.
We have a beautiful cooperation in terms of recently India signed Artemis.
Yes.
We have NISAR going on. Then we have a whole lot of collaboration for space situational awareness between the 2 countries, but that more into the civil domain, where the exploration and all comes into play. Whereas space for defense come into play, there's a big void that we see in sharing of technology.
Sure.
Are we doing it?
So the joint statement, I believe, I was reading on the way here again to remind myself of it, so I don't have the quote from it, but it does talk about space defense or defense of space or something. There's a phrase in there. So it is the first time that we've talked about it and jointly agreed that that is of mutual concern. The Artemis Accords are more than just about the peaceful uses. It's also an affirmation that space should be a place for peace, and that we shouldn't, weaponize or turn into defense the moon and other satellites and other satellites of the sun or satellites of the earth. And it was a really great, there was a lot of negotiations that went into it. We were very pleased that India joined that, and the Prime Minister gave the authorization to sign and to be part of like-minded nations that want to use space for good and not use space as new warfare. We've seen other actors blow up satellites that endanger our telecommunications, like willy-nilly, just to test weapons in space with no consequence. And those principles, I think, should be condemned and need to be fought against, not literally fought against, but diplomatically to be changed. It's kind of like AI. If we don't get out in front and define the principles of peaceful use of space, we will see the dangerous use of space. And so I'm pleased that we are now looking at joint development of principles and potentially of technology. And I think, to be clear, that technology is not about weaponizing space. It's about trying to do the opposite and making it, it was space defense, I think, was the term we used.